I'll never forget the first plaster mold that I made when I was 19 years old in art class in college. I made it and then couldn't get it apart. I couldn't get the mold open. In the process, I lost my original sculpture and my mold. Knowing what I know now, after making hundreds of molds and with a few tricks up my sleeve, I might be able to save it. Hey Mom, is that mold still in the garage? This video shows the mold making process that I've used to make wax for bronze, resin, ceramic, and paper sculptures for over 40 years. This is a two-piece plaster mold made quickly, easily, and inexpensively, assuring that it will come apart in the end. Well, we hope so anyway. I'm working here on the plasticine hand that I'm going to use to make the two-piece plaster mold. I'm rebuilding the hands for the Pride sculpture. After making the sculpture once, I decided that her emotion should be more prideful than I had it. So I remade the head and the hands. These hands are made of harder plasticine, which I think makes sculpting easier. The making of the second part of the mold looks similar to the first part, but there are critical differences, so watch until the end. The mold bed separates the two pieces of the mold and is a softer plasticine made for kids. It took me a long time to learn to cut up the original sculptures to avoid undercuts and make better plaster molds. Sorry if it looks a bit gory. I'll talk more about that later. I've set a bit of plasticine on the board so as not to dent the sculpture. I put a layer of plastic in between the sculpture and the mold bed, bringing the soft plasticine halfway up the sculpture. The mold bed has to be right up against the side of the sculpture. Sometimes I find it easier to work on the sculpture in the mold as I'm making the mold, especially when the pieces need to be smoothed. After I've built the mold bed up to the halfway point, I begin to cut away the plastic and slightly tuck the plastic in between the mold bed and the sculpture. Making a completely smooth mold bed will help the mold pieces release at the end and make for a long-lasting mold. I use a few important tools: 2 metal modeling hand tools, a rubber head modeling tool, a stiff-ish paintbrush, and a scalpel, as well as mineral oil. I used to love creating textured surfaces on my sculptures, but this papier-mâché technique in plaster molds doesn't really lend itself to that. Let's talk about undercuts. An undercut is any place where the plaster goes inside of the lower part of the sculpture, where you end up with like a mushroom shape. And anything that's hard that you put or that hardens into a plaster mold, you won't be able to get it out because there's no way for an inflexible piece of sculpture to come out of a plaster mold that doesn't have good draft or no undercuts. I've shown good drawings of this in other videos and I'll list those down below. I use the molds open, but I add registration marks for storage. The mold walls. You can use wood walls and screws each time, but I find that they fall apart quickly, so I prefer these adjustable metal walls. Each has a bend at one end so it can be clipped to the next. I plug the edges and joints with plasticine so that the liquid plaster doesn't run out. I use a soft brush to paint on mineral oil. One coat on the plasticine should do it here. This mold will take about 6 pounds or 3 kilos of dry plaster. 1.5 kilos per side. I eyeball it, but you can Google how to calculate amounts if you like working that way. This method of mixing plaster is called the Michelangelo method. I use a bucket, fill it no more than halfway up with water, sprinkle the dry plaster into the water, and let it sink until the white powder disappears beneath the surface of the water. This is called slaking. If there's water around the edges of the white plaster, add more plaster. Waiting for 1 to 2 minutes helps to avoid lumps as you stir it. Stir it with your hand or a brush, being careful not to introduce air. It should feel similar to heavy cream. It'd be great if you comment on this video and let me know if you're using this technique. I added a bit too much powdered plaster to this bucket, and so I had to kind of stick my hand underneath it in order to get the powdered plaster to move and to actually slake, and then I ended up having to put some more water on top of it. I don't really like to do that, but plaster is such a noble material, and it didn't really cause any problems. I got all the lumps out of it as I stirred it with my hand, and so it turned out to be fine, just a little bit on the hard side. Pour a bit into the well and paint it with a brush to release air bubbles. Then pour the rest and agitate. Clean the tools and the bucket before the plaster sets. Please don't clean it in your sink. It will block your pipes. The water evaporates from the cleanup bucket and it turns into this soft, spongy, lightweight material that I just throw into the trash. Let it sit for an hour or two. The walls come off easily. I like to use a sure form rasp to clean up the edges so that they don't break later. Carefully remove the soft plasticine mold bed without removing the original sculpture from the first piece of plaster. I think that choosing and using mold release is the most critical thing in making plaster molds besides knowing about undercuts. Here, I'm putting on the first of 4 coats of mineral oil because I couldn't get myself up to go dig for the Vaseline and mineral oil mix. And I think this was a mistake. I thought that 4 coats of mineral oil would be enough. I was filming, so I didn't get up to get the mineral oil and Vaseline. I know this about plaster, that if I make another batch and I put it on to the previous plaster, it won't come off unless it has the right mold release. I went ahead and put on the mold walls again, and I propped them up a little bit this time with blocks so that they would be high enough to make the next mold piece big enough. When I'm pouring bigger batches of plaster, I do a lot of buttressing on the outside of the mold with plasticine in order to make sure that the plaster doesn't run out through any holes. I did a much better job of mixing the plaster this time. Same plaster mixing as the first side. Clean up, let sit for an hour or two, remove the walls. Just a reminder, people have been making this type of mold for thousands of years. You don't need a dehydrator or a warming cabinet or any special equipment. Just a little technique, and it works really well. Normally I wait 2 weeks in the sun for molds to cure before opening them, but it's the rainy season right now and I didn't want to wait that long. So I stuck this into the dehydrator for 2 days. I had to get the peppermint and the basil out first. I have to admit that I said some bad words here. It's rare for this to happen, and maybe it was a self-fulfilling prophecy because I titled this video, "Can I get the mold open?" Don't let this stop you from making molds. I hope this doesn't stop you from making molds. More than 99% of my molds have come apart easily, and I'll show you that it's true in another video. I want to show an honest depiction of what happens in the sculpture studio because this is the way things go sometimes, and I want you to see it. And especially, if I make these mistakes, then maybe you won't have to. I think the problem was that I was filming and I didn't want to get up and dig for the mineral oil and Vaseline mix, which is the mold release that I normally use on plaster. It definitely wasn't a problem with undercuts because the little pieces of the hand are coming out just fine. What do you think it was? I think it was the Vaseline and mineral oil problem. And I'm sorry that the video here is so bad that you can't really see very well what I'm doing, but I got a little bit bothered, as you might imagine, and so I kind of forgot about the camera. I was able to get it all apart and save almost all of the pieces. I put the screwdrivers into the mold lines and then I tap it. Usually I don't have to tap it near this hard with a hammer, and usually they come apart super quickly and easily. But I had to sort of keep going and getting all these pieces of one side of the mold off of the other side. And I did ultimately do that. I'll have all the pieces to put together again. Well, I was hoping that this video would turn out a little bit better than this, and this sort of threw me off a little bit, but I think it's going to be a great opportunity to make another video and show you how I repair plaster molds using PVA glue and plaster.